There's an infinite number of parallel universes. There is an infinite possibility that there's a parallel universe. And in each reality, as every electron spins.
A 14-year-old boy sits in front of a camera in an unfinished basement. No studio lights, no producers, no script cards taped to the wall. Just a kid in a hoodie, a cheap ring light, and a voice that doesn't sound like it belongs to someone his age. He looks straight into the lens the way people do when they've stopped caring whether anyone believes them, and he says something that will be watched 11 million times in 4 days. He says the Halvorsen Deep Facility, buried under a mountain in the Canadian Rockies, didn't just smash particles together. He says it tore something open. He says it already happened weeks ago quietly without so much as a press release, and that the people running that mountain know exactly what they did and have spent every day since pretending otherwise. His name, at least the name he goes by online, is Ren Castellan. And once you hear what he says next, it's the kind of thing that follows you into the shower, into your car, into the 3 a.m. silence when you can't sleep. Ren Castellan was not supposed to be famous. He was a homeschooled kid from a logging town in British Columbia whose only public footprint, as far as anyone could tell, was a handful of comments on physics forums under a username nobody bothered to trace. Then, out of nowhere, a 12-minute video appeared on a channel with 9 subscribers, in which a boy who looked barely old enough to shave calmly explained the mathematics of vacuum decay to a whiteboard, correcting his own equations twice, laughing once at his own mistake, and never once looking like he was performing for anyone. The video sat there for 6 weeks doing nothing. Then a physics graduate student reposted it with a caption, "Okay, but who is this kid and why does his intuition for tensor calculus make me want to quit my PhD?" And within 72 hours it had crossed 2 million views. People who actually understood the material were the ones who couldn't stop watching. That's the detail that made it different from every other prodigy story. It wasn't parents pushing a talented kid in front of a camera. It was researchers, actual researchers, sending the clip to each other with messages that all said some version of, "Wait, is this real?" By the time he turned 13, Ren had built something in his garage that he called a resonance capacitor, a device, roughly the size of a filing cabinet, that he claimed could draw usable electrical current directly from ambient electromagnetic noise. He demonstrated it on camera, a string of shop lights, unplugged from any wall outlet, glowing steadily off whatever his machine was pulling from the air around it. Electrical engineers picked the footage apart frame by frame, looking for a hidden battery, a concealed cable, anything. Nobody found one. Nobody proved it was real either. It just sat there, an object that shouldn't have worked, working. That should have been the whole story, a strange, gifted kid in a garage invention nobody could fully explain. It would have been enough on its own. But 6 months later, Ren stopped talking about his own machine entirely. He turned his attention to someone else's. Buried nearly 2 kilometers under a ridge outside Invermere, British Columbia, is a facility almost nobody has heard of, because almost nobody was meant to. Officially, the Halvorsen Deep Facility is a joint research initiative between a consortium of universities and a handful of private aerospace investors, built to study high-density plasma states using a compact particle accelerator, smaller than the famous European colliders, but engineered to run at proportionally extreme energy densities inside a much shorter ring. The project was funded quietly, built quietly, and switched on quietly in a year that most people would struggle to pin down if you asked them. Ren Castellan pinned it down immediately. And in a video he posted with almost no warning, in a tone far calmer than the subject matter deserved, he said the Halvorsen ring had done exactly what its designers hoped it never would. He said that during a routine high-energy run, the facility briefly achieved a collision density beyond anything its own safety models accounted for, an accident, not a discovery, the kind of accident that happens when a machine is pushed slightly past the edge of what anyone actually understands about it. And in that instant, according to Ren, something in the structure of local space-time didn't just bend. It separated. There was a version of this happening where nothing changes. Ren says in the video, hands folded, voice flat. That's not the version we're in. We're in the other one. The seam tore, and everything on this side of it got shifted. Not destroyed. Shifted. Copied onto an adjacent branch that's close enough to the original that almost nobody notices the difference. Almost. Sit with that claim for a second, because it's a strange kind of terrifying. He's not saying the world ended. He's saying it kept going, just not this it. The version of reality you're sitting in right now, according to a 14-year-old with a whiteboard and no formal training, might be an echo of a moment that already happened somewhere else, with the deepest cracks quietly patched over so well that you'd never think to look for them. Wren went further than the single incident claim, and this is where his videos started attracting the kind of attention that makes networks nervous. He described what he called a lattice model of reality, not a single fork in the road, but an endless, layered structure of nearly identical universes stacked against each other like pages in a book so thin you can't see the gaps between them. In most of those pages, he argued, nothing is different enough to notice. A word is spelled slightly differently on a label nobody reads twice. A door in a childhood home swings the wrong way in a memory nobody double-checks. But in a small number of pages, the ones closest to wherever a tear like the one under Invermere occurs, the differences aren't small. People who shouldn't be alive are alive. Public events people remember distinctly never happen at all, or happen differently, or happen to someone else. And the unsettling part, Wren insisted, isn't how big those changes are. It's that a tear like that doesn't announce itself. There's no flash, no alarm, no sensation of falling. You cross from one page to the next the same way you cross from one breath to the next, and the only thing left behind would be a handful of memories that don't quite line up with the world you woke up in. Memories easy enough to write off as a bad recollection, a mixed-up childhood detail, a mind playing tricks. Most people do exactly that. Wren didn't think they should. What made Wren's claims spread the way they did wasn't the physics. It was what he pointed to next, something that had nothing to do with particle accelerators at all, and everything to do with a strange, well-documented phenomenon that millions of ordinary people have quietly noticed for years without ever connecting it to anything as dramatic as a torn universe. At a gathering of researchers years earlier, a woman had mentioned, almost a small talk, that she distinctly remembered a certain public figure dying in custody decades before he actually did. Not vaguely. She recalled specific footage, the coverage, the mourners, even fragments of a speech delivered by a grieving spouse. It should have been a one-off, a fluke of memory, forgotten within the hour. Instead, one person after another in that same room said they remembered it too. The same footage. The same funeral. The same speech. None of them had compared notes beforehand. None of them could explain why a memory that specific, that consistent, that shared, pointed to an event that had simply never taken place. That woman went on to document dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of similar reports pouring in from total strangers around the world. Mismatched brand logos everyone swore they remembered differently. Movie lines people were certain they'd heard that were never actually said. Historical details that entire groups of unconnected people all recalled the same wrong way. She gave the phenomenon a name, and the name stuck, and for years it lived in the same cultural bin as ghost stories and grainy UFO footage, a curiosity, nothing more. Wren refused to file it away that easily. He treated it as the single strongest piece of evidence for his entire theory. Not a glitch in memory, he argued, but scar tissue. The leftover residue of a species that got quietly moved from one branch of reality to an almost identical one, carrying just enough of the original with them to notice something was wrong, but not enough to prove it. In the branch we started in, he said, those memories were accurate. The funeral happened. The spelling was correct. The line was really spoken. It's only here, on this side of the tear, that they read as errors, because we're not remembering our history wrong. We're remembering someone else's correctly. If that's true, and it's a significant if, then the next question is the one that should actually keep you up at night. How many times has this already happened quietly underneath everyone, and how many more times is it about to happen again? To understand why Wren's claims landed the way they did with people who actually work in physics, you have to go back further, to a fight that had nothing to do with him, a fight that took place years before the Halvorsen ring was ever built, when a compact accelerator design first started circulating in academic proposals. A theoretical physicist named Dr. Adrian Kessler, a researcher with a long, well-respected career in high-energy field theory, published an internal paper raising a very specific concern, that certain proposed collision geometries, if pushed past a particular energy threshold in a sufficiently confined space, could theoretically produce highly unstable localized field states. States her paper described, cautiously, as regions of unresolved boundary behavior. She was not predicting the end of the world. She was doing what serious scientists do, which is naming the edge of what the math can currently promise, and asking that nobody build past that edge without understanding it first. Her paper didn't land quietly. Colleagues who reviewed it described a tense meeting where several senior researchers pushed back hard, arguing the risk was negligible and the project should proceed on schedule. Dr. Kessler wasn't chasing headlines. By every account, she was someone who had spent her whole career inside the math, and when she sat down to write that warning, she was doing it because the numbers genuinely worried her. The debate dragged on for 2 years. Safety reviews were conducted, commissioned, notably, by the same consortium that stood to lose years of funding and momentum if the project was delayed. That doesn't automatically make those reviews wrong. But it's worth sitting with the fact that the people reassuring the public were also the people whose careers depended on the machine getting built. The ring was switched on anyway. And for years, nothing visibly went wrong. No incident reports, no headlines, no sirens. Just data, quietly accumulating, quietly published in specialist journals nobody outside the field ever reads. Here's the part of the story that isn't fiction dressed up as physics. It's the part that's genuinely, unglamorously true about how science works, which is that experiments frequently produce results nobody predicted and nobody can fully explain, and that's not usually evidence of a conspiracy. It's evidence that the universe is larger than our models of it. In our story, the Halvorsen team, several runs into the project, began detecting short-lived particle signatures in their collision debris that didn't cleanly match any predicted structure in their models. The internal team nicknamed them ghost states, not because anyone seriously believed they were paranormal, but because the label stuck as an inside joke that got repeated so often it became the working name. The signatures were faint, inconsistent, and maddeningly difficult to reproduce on demand, which is exactly the kind of result that makes a research team both excited and quietly nervous, because it means either their equipment has a flaw they haven't found yet, or they've stumbled onto something real that their theory doesn't yet have language for. This is historically an old and unglamorous story in physics. Real particle accelerators, the actual ones operating today, doing real science, causing no rifts in reality whatsoever, have spent decades chasing dark matter candidates without conclusively finding one, and have occasionally turned up genuinely strange, hard-to-classify particle states that took years of careful, boring, repeatable experimentation to explain. That process is slow. It's supposed to be slow. Mystery in real science is usually a placeholder for "we haven't finished the work yet," not a placeholder for "something supernatural happened here." But Wren, in the story, didn't read the ghost states that way. He treated every unexplained signal as confirmation. He argued that the reason the Halvorsen team couldn't cleanly classify what they were seeing was because their instruments were straddling the seam itself, catching flickers of a structure that belonged, however briefly, to the branch of reality that had been sheared away. "You can't fully measure something," he said in one of his last videos, "if the thing you're measuring is only half here." 6 weeks after his first video about the mountain, a small independent science journalist named Priya Okafor managed to do something no major outlet had. She got Wren Castellan to sit down for an actual, unscripted, on-record conversation. Not a curated clip. Not a highlight reel edited for maximum unease. A full 91 minutes, uploaded raw, timestamps and all, because Okafor said afterward that cutting any of it would have made it easier for people to dismiss. What's striking about the interview, watching it now, is how little Wren performs. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't reach for dramatic language. When Okafor pushes back hard, at several points, with real technical questions about field boundary conditions and whether his math actually supports the conclusions he's drawing from it, he doesn't get defensive. He pauses, thinks, sometimes admits a piece of his reasoning is weaker than he'd like it to be, and then keeps going anyway. "I know how this sounds," he tells her, about 40 minutes in. "I know what it sounds like when a teenager says the universe broke and only he noticed. I'd be skeptical of me too. I just don't think being embarrassing and being right are mutually exclusive." At one point, Okafor asks him directly whether he's afraid, not afraid of being wrong, but afraid of what happens if he's right. He's quiet for almost 8 seconds, which is a long time on camera, long enough that later clips of just that silence went semi-viral on their own. Then he says something that a lot of viewers later described as the line that made the whole theory stop feeling like entertainment and start feeling like something heavier. "If I'm right," he says, "it means the version of me that started this doesn't exist anymore. It means somewhere behind us there's an original timeline where none of this happened, and we're the copy that has to live with knowing it might not be real." That's not a fun thing to sit with at 14. But not sitting with it doesn't make it less true. That single exchange did more to spread the theory than any of his standalone videos. It wasn't the science. It was the sincerity. People who had never cared about particle physics in their life found themselves rewatching those 8 seconds of silence, trying to decide whether they just watched a frightened kid talk himself into something, or a frightened kid finally say something nobody else had the nerve to. If the story had ended there, one boy, one mountain, one theory, it might have faded the way most viral science mysteries eventually do, replaced within a season by the next strange claim scrolling past. What kept it alive, and what made even committed skeptics pause, was what happened next at a completely unrelated site nearly 6,000 miles away. A research collaboration operating a separate compact accelerator outside Porto Alegre, Brazil, smaller than Halvorsen, older, running a different collision geometry entirely, with no connection to Ren, no knowledge of his videos, no reason to be paying attention to a teenager's theory about torn dimensions, quietly logged an anomaly of its own during a routine calibration run. Internal notes, later leaked by a junior technician who said she felt uneasy sitting on them, described a brief, unexplained spike in background radiation readings across 3 separate detector arrays simultaneously, lasting less than 4 seconds, with no clear source anyone could identify. The facility's official statement called it a transient instrumentation artifact consistent with known detector noise patterns and moved on. Most outlets that covered it at all ran a single paragraph and dropped the story within a day. Ren didn't drop it. He built an entire follow-up video around the Porto Alegre readings, laying the timestamp of their anomaly next to the timestamp of a smaller, unpublicized test run at Halvorsen that had occurred less than 11 hours earlier. He wasn't claiming the two events were caused by each other directly. His theory was stranger than that. He argued that once a seam has been opened anywhere, the surrounding lattice of nearly identical universes becomes measurably less stable everywhere else, the way a single crack in a windshield puts stress on glass far from the point of impact. It doesn't have to happen at the same place twice, he said. It just has to happen somewhere close enough in the lattice that the vibration reaches other seams already under strain. Physicists who bothered to respond publicly were, unsurprisingly, unimpressed by the connection. Correlation between 2 unrelated instrumentation blips separated by continents in 11 hours, several noted, is exactly the kind of pattern matching the human brain is built to manufacture out of pure coincidence, especially when it's already primed to look for one. That's a fair, important point worth sitting with as much as any of Ren's claims, because the far more mundane explanation, that 2 separate facilities each experience 2 separate, boring, explainable equipment quirks in the same general week, is statistically the much likelier story. But boring and likely has never been especially good at competing with connected and terrifying for public attention, and the Porto Alegre coincidence spread through the same channels the earlier evidence had, gaining its own momentum entirely independent of whether it held up to scrutiny. Under mounting public pressure, the Halvorsen Consortium eventually issued a formal statement, the kind of carefully worded release that says a great deal by choosing its omissions carefully. It confirmed the facility had experienced a brief anomalous energy signature during one collision run, attributed it to a known class of detector calibration drift associated with cryogenic magnet cycling, and stated unequivocally that all safety protocols had performed exactly as designed throughout. It did not mention Ren by name. It did not explain why the specific run in question had been quietly excluded from the facility's otherwise public data release schedule, a detail an outside auditor noticed almost by accident while cross-referencing publication logs for an unrelated project. None of that proves concealment. Research institutions redact and delay data release for all kinds of ordinary, defensible reasons: incomplete analysis, pending peer review, contractual obligations to funding partners who want first look at proprietary results. It's entirely possible, maybe even likely, that the missing run was excluded for exactly one of those unglamorous reasons and nothing more. But in the information vacuum left by a technical, hedge-filled press release, absence of explanation tends to get filled in by the loudest, most emotionally satisfying story available, and Ren's story was, by a wide margin, the loudest and most emotionally satisfying one in the room. It's worth pausing on something that gets lost in most retellings of this story, which is that Ren didn't build his following out of nothing. Long before the mountain, long before the strange particle signatures, there was already a quiet audience of people who had watched his early videos on his own resonance capacitor and walked away half convinced they'd seen something they couldn't explain. Electrical engineers who picked the footage apart frame by frame and never found the trick. Physics teachers who assigned his early whiteboard videos to their own students, not as proof of anything, but as an example of unusually clear reasoning from someone who hadn't yet been taught the standard shortcuts. That existing trust is a big part of why the dimension tier claims spread as fast as they did. People weren't meeting a stranger making an outrageous claim for the first time. They were hearing it from someone who had already, in their minds, earned the benefit of the doubt once before. That's a pattern worth naming honestly, inside this story and well beyond it. Trust, once earned in one domain tends to get quietly extended into domains where it hasn't actually been tested yet. A person who is demonstrably talented at one kind of problem doesn't automatically become reliable at a completely different kind of claim, especially one this far outside any established, peer-reviewed framework. That doesn't make Wren a fraud inside the story, and it doesn't make his early audience foolish for listening. It just means the thing that made people believe him wasn't actually evidence about torn dimensions at all. It was evidence about him, and those are two very different kinds of proof, easy to mistake for each other in the moment, much harder to tell apart in hindsight. So here's where the story sits. A quiet facility under a mountain, built to study conditions nobody has ever safely recreated before, run by people who insist everything is under control. A gifted, strange, unverifiable kid who says it already went wrong once, and that the evidence is scattered across millions of ordinary memories that don't add up. A respected physicist who tried to raise the alarm years before the machine was ever switched on and was overruled by the people whose funding depended on switching it on anyway. And a research team that keeps finding things in their data they can name but can't yet explain. None of that, on its own, proves anything. That's worth saying plainly, inside the story and outside of it. Unexplained data is the normal texture of real research. Contested safety debates happen before most ambitious experiments, and shared false memories are a well-documented feature of ordinary human psychology, not evidence of a shattered timeline. A good mystery doesn't need to be true to be worth telling. It just needs to sit close enough to the things we don't fully understand, memory, physics, the limits of our own instruments, that it's hard to shake once you've heard it. Wren Castellan, whoever he really is inside this story, never walked back a single claim. He kept posting calmly, methodically, treating each new unexplained result out of the mountain as one more page in a case file. He seemed to believe he was the only one reading correctly. Maybe he was a kid who genuinely saw a pattern nobody else had the nerve to name. Maybe he was a brilliant, lonely teenager who fell in love with a theory the way people sometimes do, and started seeing its fingerprints everywhere because he wanted to. The story doesn't resolve that question, and maybe it isn't supposed to. What it leaves you with is smaller and stranger than an answer. It leaves you with the shape of the questions themselves. Why does a shared false memory feel so much like a real one that even skeptical, careful people sometimes can't tell the difference? Why do the smartest people in a room sometimes disagree so completely about how much risk is acceptable in the name of discovery? And why, when an experiment finds something it can't explain, does it feel so much easier to reach for a story about torn dimensions than to sit with a much stranger, much more ordinary truth that we build a machine capable of touching the edge of what we understand, and it did exactly what machines like that are supposed to do. It showed us how much we still don't know.